Yeah, so welcome for this afternoon to the climate discussion. We are going to start with a meditative practice so we can then dive into why we're here. I titled this practice today, this particular discussion, that nature treats us all equally, but our human ignorance divides us. So nature sees all of us 100% equally. We're all welcomed, just like every plant in your garden is welcomed according to nature. Even though according to you, some of those plants are weeds, and some of them are food. But according to nature, it's all unconditional and welcoming. And so I'd like to do a short practice on that unconditional welcome that has already been granted to you by the fact that you were born and you're here. So please rest your hands in your lap or wherever they're most comfortable for you. You're welcome to close your eyes. You can also keep them open and just gently gazing down. So there's a quietude to your senses. You welcome your body to relax into the here and now. You could imagine softening the skin of the outer body, and that the layer of the skin is this kind of illusory boundary between us and the rest of the cosmos. As you relax the outer body, imagine that you're welcoming this sort of interbeingness between you and nature, from which you have never been separated. We may be a bit like fish in the ocean when one fish asks the other fish, "Have you heard of water? Where is the water? What is this thing called water?" And the more experienced fish says to the baby fish, "Oh, my dear, you're swimming in it. It's all around you. It's holding you now." And the baby fish wanders off to the next fish to say, "I've heard of this thing called water. Can you tell me about it?" So we have the same kind of disconnection often from nature. And yet we were born from nature. We are a part of nature. We are completely dependent upon nature. Nature expresses itself through us, as us. I'd like you to imagine in your body this naturalness of breathing and being breathed. Imagine the naturalness of circulation, which is happening in your body right now, quite on your behalf, without you having to choreograph it. The circulation is occurring. Imagine in the inner body, the innervation, which is going from a central destination outwards and then returning to that central location. We have nerve pathways they call afferent and efferent, moving away and returning towards, just like circulation, moving out, returning back. You can imagine that pulsation like the pulsation of the ocean. The tide comes in and the tide goes out, according to our experience of it. you picture these vital functions for today, we just consider respiration, circulation, innervation. Picture them as expressions of nature, like the wind, the waterways, communication of the nervous system of the ecology, like mycelia, speaking to each other, the birch trees sharing a common root system. As you imagine this, consider that you have been already unconditionally welcomed here. In a way, it's a miracle that any one of us comes into birth, because it means that we've had some genetic lineage that has survived, other disasters and famines and illnesses on the planet and some harsh circumstances. And yet your genetic line has made it possible for you to be here. Consider kind of deeply relaxing into that awareness, and perhaps you could offer to yourself a kind of unconditional, warm regard that you're here and you're interested in yoga and also in climate. And may this unconditional, positive regard for yourself, may that be stronger than the sort of petty criticisms we make of ourselves. Please raise your hands to your heart. And with your exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. Release both hands as you're ready to. And you're welcome to open your eyes if you like. So when I look at the climate and I want to start a conversation with us, those of us who are gathered here today, there are a couple of phrases that we're using in the kind of climate network or the climate discussions. One of those phrases is the global north and the global south. So I want to explain what that is so you can have a reference point for it if I talk about the global north and the global south. It really means geographically what is above the hemisphere and what is below the hemisphere. But in the language of climate, those of us in the global north, we are experiencing climate events, but not as soon as and not as devastatingly as the global south has already experienced. So the global south, below the hemisphere, that enormous community of people who live in the global south, the climate has already affected their regions much more strongly than it has affected the region of the global north. And yet the other way we talk about global north and global south is that the people who live in the global south have had a significantly less impact on the climate relative to the people who live in the global north, who are a part of what is called dominant culture. And so dominant culture refers to those of us who are in a kind of post-industrialized society, living in what is called a merchant culture in my language, merchant culture versus indigenous culture, or industrialized culture versus indigenous culture, or the pursuit of economic growth. And this mindset that there's infinite opportunity and infinite growth economically is why we're here on the planet. Now, I live in a society that has that orientation. I don't personally have that orientation, but I live in a society that has that orientation. And insofar as I operate my life in this society, I'm a part of the global north, and I'm a part of the dominant culture as a citizen. I'm not in my mindset, but I am as a citizen. And I've had some responsibility for, in this regard, then, how my actions have affected the global south. And so we call that the global north and the global south. And when we refer to the population that has done the most damage to the climate, we refer to the dominant culture of the global north. And therefore, I take to heart that I have had an impact and that it matters to me that I wake up to my impact and see what I can do for reparation or advocacy or taking action or raising awareness. And that's one reason that we're here, is that we can together help to raise more awareness of this, at least in our own lives initially, and then perhaps rippling out from our lives to be in conversation with others. I do find that the conversation is difficult to sort of strike up with your neighbor. You know, hey, did you know you're part of the global north and part of the dominant culture of the global north? Have you checked your impact today? You know, people don't want to just start a conversation where they feel like they might be accused of something that they didn't even know about, right? And it's not a conversation of accusing ourselves or others of anything. It's a conversation of realizing that our privilege, for those of us in a privileged part of this society in the dominant culture of the global north, we have had an impact. Of course, there are many people who live in the global north, in the dominant culture even, who are not privileged. They have faced the economic and educational and racial injustice of our society. So when we look at the impact that we have had, each of us is going to look personally to ask ourselves into what contribution I've had that has made a difference or has had an impact, and what can I do less of in terms of that impact? How can I reduce my impact while I'm raising my awareness? For my sense of the injustices in society, that's why I titled the subtitle of this particular talk, you know, nature sees us all equally, human ignorance divides us. That we have had a very difficult time seeing ourselves as self unto self, or seeing ourselves as like one global family. We don't see ourselves as one citizenry. There's a lot of human ignorance that creates things like greed and possessiveness and power and dominance and oppression and the messes that we see in our society and in our civilization, the vulnerabilities that we now see as a result of those, basically those messes, those significant misunderstandings about what it even means to be born or to be here on the planet, right? That kind of level of misunderstanding. Of course, it's also worth noting that many people right now are just facing basic survival issues, like just fundamental survival is their main orientation every day. And I'll share some examples from my climate teachers and the climate scientists and the journalists and the advocacy people that I know as I get deeper into our talk. But I want to name that people are facing survival as like it's an imperative for them simply to survive. And that happens all over the planet, though it happens in greater percentage in the global south because of the drought and the rising level of the sea and food scarcity and migration and temperatures and so many things like this. Recently, in different countries, we've had the wildfires, like in Maui, in the Hawaiian region, where people they've lost everything and they have to be displaced. There was an earthquake in Morocco over the weekend. It happened in the nighttime and people were sleeping. So some knew something was happening and were able to kind of escape danger, but many could not escape danger. And the death toll there is rising, and people are currently displaced from their homes, and both Moroccan citizens and tourists are sleeping on the sidewalks and hoping that there's not going to be another after effect. So of course there were major floods and there's wildfires in Canada, and the forest that's burning in Canada is essential to the climate as much as the Amazon forest has been essential to the climate. So when I see these climate events, which is how I refer to them, not weather events, when I see them through the lens of climate and what I would think of as like climate despair. So when I see the forest is still on fire in Canada, I feel grateful when a city is evacuated and humans aren't losing their lives. But I'm also looking at what that means, that there's a fire there for so long, and that it's so hard to fight that fire, and there's so much drought, and what it also means for the carbon sink that we're losing for a breathable planet. So I'm listening to it through a lens beyond no lives were lost, as the news is reporting that. The news will report what has happened to people. It will say a bit what is happening with nature, but it's only in recent times that our news reporters and weather reporters are talking about it as climate. And I think that's been celebrated recently by some journalists, that they actually heard people on the news using the term climate or climate devastation or climate catastrophe. Climate despair is a word that I use on a regular basis. So what can happen as you start talking about climate is that your awareness of it is also going to wake up, and it can feel really difficult and very lonely. There can be a kind of heavy-heartedness about it. So it's my job to inoculate you about that, but as you consider it more deeply, it's not a fear-free conversation. It is a scary thing. We ought to feel frightened because our nervous systems have adapted to so much comfort in our global north dominant culture. We've had so much ease and comfort and privilege and resource, and we've created societies that can make all that resource. We haven't really been in touch with the fear that we ought to have about our climate. And we're living in a place that's not as deeply affected by the climate. Here in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon, it hasn't been so terrible this year. We didn't have 110, 115 degree summer. We didn't have a wildfire that took out my beloved home at Brighton Beach Hot Springs. And we didn't have the same level of events here. We had an ice storm that was difficult. I was in India at the time, so I didn't have to live through that ice storm. We've had some things, but we aren't so deeply affected. And so what can happen is that our nervous systems are not actually tuning in to the level of urgency and timeliness and fear that we ought to be experiencing, like a valid, important fear to feel. We have also had the privilege of a more comfortable life, and we have ways to escape our fears and apprehensions. We have a lot of ways to medicate ourselves or to soothe or distract ourselves. And so our society is not practiced at coming together in the questions that are facing civilization. We're practiced at withdrawing and numbing out, or getting together for happy hour, or for shopping for some people, or big events with concerts and music, all wonderful things to do. And I do hope that sometimes when we come together for those big events, maybe the musicians or the presenters or something could, let us take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're having this concert on, and to acknowledge the vulnerability of people everywhere, and use platforms that could generate awareness to do that more often. I'm not in that kind of platform, and I'm not a consultant to those sorts of platforms right now, so I don't have an in there. But sometimes I mention something and then you have an in somewhere and you can mention it to somebody. So backing the camera up now as to how yoga is relevant here. How does the yoga come into this? My experience is that yoga, it awakens people to so much, as you just heard from Stevie and Mandy and Maria, that we are awakened to our own lives and our potential, and also to some tears and some vulnerabilities. We become more sensitive as people. We become more sensitive in a positive way, not in that way that people criticize you for being too sensitive, but a very positive kind of sensitivity to life. And so my guess is that as our students come to yoga, as we practice yoga, we're going to be more and more aware of the climate, because our bodies know that things are changing. The somatic experience of it is known to your body already. And if we were someone who, we might use the phrase climate affected, like you've been in a devastation zone, you've actually experienced the fire up close. I was not up close at Brighton Bush when it happened. I was here in Portland, but I did go very shortly after that. It's a big thing for your body to feel either the actual event or the aftermath of the event. And so we also need yoga to help us to digest these emotions, to take in the experience, and to listen inwardly for the guidance and the wisdom of what we can do, how we can participate. So since our students' bodies know something is happening, I want us to be aware of climate. And you may use your classroom or your community or a relationship to speak about it with people. You may not be prepared for that yet. It might not be the next thing that you do. But as you will see for myself with the Dia Foundation, we added this to the schedule, and we added it in September of 2020 when the wildfires burned Talent, Oregon to the ground, and when Brighton-Bush Hot Springs lost 75 of its buildings, which were all the guest cabins and many of the staff homes. And nearby to Brighton-Bush, all of the summer homes were burned to the ground. So a whole village of people, they basically lost everything. That wasn't a unique event, but it was really close to me geographically. At the same time that that was happening, Oregon evacuated 3 of its prisons in the I-5 corridor. I've been teaching in Oregon's prison since 1998. They had a plan of evacuation, but they've never had to use it within 6 hours to get people out. And they had to be relocated to eastern prisons, which were not ready to greet and double the size of their population immediately. So there was a huge thing for me there also that I couldn't be of any help to that circumstance. And I could just feel the fear and the agitation and the terror of the adults in custody who were being relocated. And yet you couldn't keep them in the I-5 corridor either because of the smoke and the potential for fire and other kinds of evacuation. So all that together really raised it up in my awareness that this is such an essential event and it's affecting us all. So nature treats us all equally, I like to say, and we're all as dependent upon this ecology as any other thing is dependent upon it. Like our species and the species that have remained, those that have not gone extinct, we're all dependent upon this really unique ecological circumstance for our viability, for our survival. And yet a certain sort of powerful force in the world, greed, significantly pointing to the fossil fuel industry, and most recently, even more vocalization about that from journalists and broadcasters on climate. That force has so adversely and negatively impacted the entire ecology based on ignorance and greed and colonization and privilege and power and oppression, that we're all suffering the result of that industry right now. And that industry is something that we've all also been relying on. If you drove a car, you relied on fossil fuels to get here. If you have some gas in your stove in your kitchen, you're relying on quote unquote natural gas to cook with. We're relying on the fossil fuel industry for some of our technologies to stay warm enough or cool enough and all the things. So keeping that in mind, that there's a massive industry that has so adversely affected the climate for everyone. We're all going to be subject to it, but it's unfortunately adversely influenced the global South and people of color and people in poverty and people without the privilege to relocate. They have been affected much more adversely, much sooner, and in much greater numbers. One of the journalists that I like to follow is David Wallace. Now, I always mix up his last name because it's 2 W words, and I do have a concussion, and I'm prone to word finding challenges anyway. So I want to say David Welsh or David Wallace Welsh, something like this. He wrote the book, The Uninhabitable Earth. Did I get his name, Maria? You can let me know.
Yeah, David Wallace Wells.
Thank you, David Wallace Wells. So he was recently discussing in a podcast or an interview with Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! And he was telling her that, for example, a person on the African continent who is using some, fossil fuels or making an impact on the climate, who's got an impact on the resources that we all share. For them, for one individual there, it is like the equivalent of a person in Britain using their tea kettle. Or a person in Morocco using some resources, it's the equivalent of me having a refrigerator, which is plugged in now. And since I built a community house here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dwellings here. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 mini fridges, 2 family-sized fridges, and 1 large refrigerator with a freezer. So we're living collectively here. We have a community living structure. We share resources, but we all have our own tiny refrigerators. Mine is a mini fridge, because it's fine to have a small amount of food in the fridge, and I grow a lot in the garden. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10. We are using the equivalent of 10 people in Morocco in a year. Okay, in their year. Maybe in the lifetime. I can't recall how he said it so specifically. Could be their lifetime, which is even more devastating to think about. But the difference, the disparity in that regard is so significant that when I open my refrigerator, I think about it. I recognize. And I want to encourage us to recognize the privilege that we have. So we're really aware of, and it becomes more precious to us what we're using and what resources we do have access to. And also so we can look at how we might shift our mindset from needing more to having enough. So we live in a culture that keeps telling us that we need more. We need more resource of all kind, particularly money is one of those things, and security, and we need more of that for ourselves and our family, versus looking at maybe we have enough and we have enough to share. We have enough to open ourselves up to generosity and simplicity as a mindset. And this is also where yoga comes in as a beautiful practice and a path, because it encourages us to live more simply and to feel how that benefits our mental well-being, our physical well-being, and our relationships, and our relationship then with the earth and what we do possess in this lifetime. I think it was Shakespeare who said, or somebody said, you can't take it with you. So what he was referring to, what they're referring to in that particular quote is, when you die, you don't take any of these things with you. Of course, we know that in some cultures on the planet, people, when they died, they were buried in these massive, support structures, pyramids, and they took stuff with them because at the time of that civilization, that was the understanding, that they were going to be taking it with them. But we do know now, in a contemporary way, we're not taking our possessions with us. So the mindset of needing more, by the way, that can travel with you for your whole life. But the mindset of having enough is a radical shift of perspective. And we can ask ourselves to practice santosha, for example, which means contentment. I have enough. To practice the art of simplicity, a gentleness in our living that's called marjava, to have this gentleness of living. Simplicity is also referred to as free or humility. Can we live with this kind of humility? So I just want to point to one other thing and then see what questions you have so we can talk about it together. So insofar as we have an ability, for those of us who are still stable enough and those of us who have awareness enough and we have an inclination to, we have an ability to start making a ripple effect to other people. But it's going to start with conversations that we can have here. Because it's very hard to just approach your neighbor, for example, or even a family member. They may not want to talk about it either. Sometimes it's the spouse who doesn't want to discuss it with you. But you're going to start hearing a language spoken in our culture where people are like, on a really beautiful day, they're like, oh, the weather is so great. And we're in Portland, Oregon. So for those of you who are new to this region, I think Davika just moved to the Pacific Northwest from Indiana. I don't recall the weather system in Indiana, Davika, but it used to rain here. It rained in April, May, and June. And we might get red strawberries in July, near the 4th of July. And then it began getting rainy and windy in September. And then we had Indian summer. So we got some more heat through October. Now we have fewer days of rain. And when the weather is beautiful in the spring and people are talking about it, I'm hearing climate. I'm hearing drought. I'm like, oh yes, it's so beautiful. And there's the possibility of drought later in the summer. I'm listening for the language culture. Of course, they're appreciating a beautiful day, and that's wonderful. And yet I want us also to see the changes in our climate and be aware of them. I don't need you to be like bludgeoning yourself with it or, after yourself all the time in any kind of harassing way. But if you start listening for the way people talk about things, there's a sense that they're not paying attention to the climate. I had some friends who traveled to Spain for a holiday and they're like, oh, it's such a beautiful climate. It was so wonderful to be there. The week after they were there was the horrible heat wave. And people were like, feeling scorched by the whole situation of being there. That my friends just got a lucky vacation in that regard. And if you think about even who gets to have a vacation on the planet, who goes on vacation? It's not people who lack the resources to do so and or who are living just for survival. So in terms of, again, the global south and the lack of resources, having a holiday and going on vacation is a privilege that we have. And we have this privilege to travel to beautiful places and experience other cultures. I hope that it wakes us up when we see other cultures. It helps us to awaken to a more ancient society or a more indigenous way of living. So we can see our place in the world and not just see the world as ours to have good experiences with while we're here. The concept of a bucket list is very common in this country. That's another kind of privileged way to think about it. I have a bucket list. I don't need to see the Eiffel Tower. I don't have a bucket list for climbing Kilimanjaro. I don't have a bucket list. I have a deep desire to serve and participate and be awake to life. But you'll start hearing this language coming around, and that's one reason why it could be hard to start a conversation. When your neighbor tells you about the beautiful vacation they had on the tropical coast of such and such, it may not be the right time to talk to them about drought and rising sea levels because they don't want to hear it. But you're going to start hearing things, and I want to just prepare you that as you become aware, you won't be able to hear them in the same way. You may not be able to say to the individual that you're talking to in a totally genuine way, that sounds so amazing. Because you're also going to be realizing, oh yeah, and the sea levels will rise, and good thing you got to go to that coast before the sea level came up too high. Would be inappropriate to say that to some people, and we don't need greater discord. We need greater connection with each other. We need greater sense of community about this dilemma. So I wanted to start these climate awareness groups so that we could have conversations and develop some conversation skills also for how we're going to potentially respond to somebody or invite a conversation. Or if someone approached us, wouldn't that be so refreshing? If your neighbor came up to you and was like, just been feeling so concerned about the climate. Here's an inside thing for me. My neighbors are growing grass. I don't want them to have lawns. I want them to grow food. Right. And so when I watch my neighbors taking care of their lawn, I don't say anything to them directly, but I have at other times said to the neighborhood, hey, we could grow food in these areas in our neighborhood, and we could each sort of choose something that we're growing for each other. Wouldn't that be a cool thing to do as a neighborhood? And while I got a couple neighbors who said yes to that, within the very next month, I got my second concussion, and I have not been able to be robust about following through on that as of yet. Though I have been robust about my own gardening, as those of you who were here yesterday got to have a little tour. I haven't been able to make that initiative in my neighborhood as strongly as I would have liked to. I had at least 6 months of having to deeply rest from the second concussion. It was very significant. So in this regard, this is why we're here to have conversations, basically. I also want to be able to point to how yoga can help us and how the principles and values of yoga, when they awaken in us, we become better climate advocates, but also we start using fewer resources in an inappropriate way, and we do contribute to the greater good. And everybody has to start, just as beginners do with yoga, we start where we are. So I'm not asking you to become a journalist right now or to, hold up the intersection in downtown Portland with a sign about the climate. I'm not asking you to be more than you can be, but only to come into awareness about it. So let me pause there and see what comments or conversations or questions.
Yeah, I'd like to commend Sarah Joy. From my own experience, I'm an activist, and my work intersect with climate activism, and even in the activism world. And this has been coming up a lot in the embodied social justice movement that really kicked off, especially after the pandemic. But honestly and humbly, from like my personal experience, I noticed there are more than two groups, but the two main groups, if I would call it this way, if I would summarize it, of people, excuse me, who are passionate about climate or want to do something, or who are not. I noticed like two patterns. Those who are, you're right, like the closest people to us don't want to talk about it. And I sensed the apprehension that because, and I understand it, I have compassion for it, people feel paralyzed. They think whatever, they don't know what to do because this is out of their control. And whatever they do is not enough.
Mm.
So what I noticed, and I'm sensitive to emotions, I tend to observe. So like people are pulling back because they feel either the issue is making them more ignorant or hopeless or inadequate, and they don't want to talk about it. The other group I observed in my work, going back to embodied social justice, those who are coming to talk about it to us, some of them are angry and projecting like they coming from this space of anger and kind of like blaming the world and blaming everyone. So coming back to what Mandy said, that we really need to heal and come back to our own mindfulness and wisdom and essence to show up of greater impact in the world. And that has been happening a lot in the social justice movement. Like, how am I showing up? How am I really delivering my message? Am I truly impacting people and creating change or not? So I don't know, like people are feeling paralyzed and they think whatever they do, it's in vain. That's it. That's my sharing.
I do think that's accurate, that there's a kind of paralysis that has taken over. It makes people easier to market to also for the merchant culture that we live in. When we feel, fear and apprehension, but it becomes paralysis, a little bit closer to like, people can become almost like zombie-like about it, or like, I don't know what to do, like a deer in headlights, they're stuck, right? Yeah. How about others, questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a comment aligning with what Muna said, that when people feel inadequate, especially when you pointed out that we had this difficult conversation at home, it's difficult is because I and my husband are, I wouldn't say in opposite direction, but are not in alignment with this whole discussion, because he feels his own alone efforts, how are they enough? So how does it matter? And there is a phrase in Marathi, in my mother tongue, that says "Thembe thembe tare satse," which means every little drop then becomes an ocean. So I tell him even his own individual efforts are not really going to magically change anything. But when he puts his one effort into practice and it becomes a daily practice, and our children see it, and then they talk about it, and then our friends come and see, and they see how we are trying to recycle, reduce, repurpose, do all of that mindfully. And then our children and their children hopefully have some or the other resources left to use by then, is the hope. It's not like I'm here, I have used everything, I'm going to die, it doesn't matter what happens to others who are left behind. It's their battles. So when things are really scarce and when the world is on the brink of ending, it's their battle to fight at that point. Is so it's strange. I know it's inadequate, but that's what I try to tell him, that it ripples that we talk about when people see, and even little small change when people come over in a large gathering at home during festivals, and it's a norm to have paper plates and paper, anything disposable makes me really anxious. So I have stocked a lot of steel plates that are used in India a lot, and I've got those, or melamine, or anything reusable, avoiding plastic. And then they are like, hey, but you're going to sit and wash all of this. I said, but that's easier than creating so much trash. But then there'll be somebody who would say, but you're wasting so much water. So so it felt like this was like a fight, like one up over the other, trying to prove, but I'm saving water but using disposables, and you're using reusable but wasting water. So I mean, I don't know why this is so hard and we have to fight so much about it. Do your bit, whatever works for your lifestyle, for your sanity, for your peace, for your comfort, but do something, whatever little bit that you can do. Yeah, this is a stressful topic for me because I have gotten agitated with friends who have not understood my point of view, and now I have realized that I don't have to judge them and get so agitated, but I just have to do me, and hopefully at least one will follow.
Yes, and I think you're very correct in this regard, that we are capable of creating a ripple effect. And one of the ways that the ripple effect works in yoga is that when we make a dedication to something ourselves, like there's a word in yoga called tyaga. It means making the commitment to give up the lesser desire for the greater desire. When I have this tyaga, this lesser desire for the greater desire, I make a commitment, and that commitment begins to slowly transform my view and my thoughts and my actions. I'm being transformed by the daily practice of tyaga. In the same way, when your spouse makes a commitment, and I can't use your native tongue because I don't know it, but I think the phrase was like little bit by little bit, every drop makes a difference. It's all going to accumulate. So he's going to have a ripple effect that will ultimately then become like a watershed effect. It may be slow at the start, but having children realize what's happening, and having the friends of the children and the friends of the friends of the children are inheriting this dilemma more significantly and more painfully than we are. And as adults in this society, I would feel remiss if I was doing nothing right now. As the same that I would feel remiss if the house was on fire and I let the children figure out how to get out of the house. I wouldn't feel comfortable with anything remotely like that myself. So in this case, I love that ripple effect that you're talking about, Devika. And I also think it's an interesting thing about this. I know the stainless steel plates, I know what those are, and then all the disposable. And the fact that we even have disposable is that we have a society of disposables. These disposables are not so disposable. Where are they going? They're creating machines to try to pull the trash out of the ocean that we have put in the ocean. The disposable idea of a lifestyle of disposable things is part of the problem. In fact, it's a mindset that has led to people in power having an idea that people are disposable, people are interchangeable, their families are disposable. Even the things like the cell phones that we're so accustomed to, we're accustomed to updating that phone and getting a new one on such a regular basis. People are expecting that every year. But if you know where the cobalt comes from to make your phone, you will never want another phone. You will not know that you've contributed to the devastation of what it takes to get the cobalt out of the earth, and who is doing that work, and how they are suffering on pennies a day to do the work while being exposed to toxic elements from the mines that they're getting the cobalt from. And these are not primarily adults doing that work. It's teenagers and children doing this. There are adults, there are moms with babies on their backs in the mines trying to get the cobalt. right? So this is a very devastating circumstance, how we get these phones and these laptops, which I'm talking to you through right now. And it's so smooth and it works so effectively. And as I said on Friday night in our Dharma talk, we only recently have this bill in the legislature in Oregon, in the legislation, that we could have the right to repair our own devices. Like be trained how to repair our phone, repair our computer, versus having to just hand it in for a new one or give it back to the company and get a new one. So that might seem like a small thing to gain in our legislation, but it's a significant thing, actually. The amount of waste that happens from phones and other devices is huge. And the guy who came canvassing at my house gave me the statistics, which I cannot remember to quote it to you accurately right now. How about any comments here in this room that we're sharing? And anybody else on Zoom also is welcome to share.
I actually like work with kind of like the emotional state of climate dissonance or climate stress, right? That you're saying shows up in people's bodies. And I think that I'm just trying to think about how, when you're explaining, this idea of dissonance and not wanting to act because you're like the deer in the headlights, that part of the what we face as human beings in a privileged part of the world, part of the globe, in that manner, is, almost like that's like a nihilistic sort of view of, that comes along with everything else in our capitalistic society. And that part of a way through that I could see that yoga could help is learning presence, right? So coming into, even if there's a feeling and emotion of like nihilism, like who cares, like being willing to explore that right in your body, to like get to the source of what that is. I find inspiration. I mean, I can be nihilistic at times too, like there's no hope, like, and where do I go from there? Like in my own curiosity, like how do I move forward? So I just wanted to share that I think it's natural to have that feeling in this state of where we are, if you have any awareness at all of the facts of what's happening, right, in science. And I mean, in Portland, we're pretty privileged that way too, because we do have sources of information that inform us in this more micro community to some degree. I think very liberal. I'm also thinking about the Pacific Northwest, the state of nature, the value of nature in our culture here. But so I guess I just wanted to honor that, that is a part of it, and we can't really bypass it. It's like we have to learn how to be with it, and yoga can help us learn how to be with our own like fear, and then maybe we can then be inspired to act in new ways that do cause a ripple effect. But it's really about, I mean, probably not, our one action is not going to save the whole planet, but we can build community in those actions and build hope with each other.
Yeah, and that whole sense of what you're talking about there, if we can build those connections, we also have more courage for additional connections and for the new frontier of connection, or more courage to speak up to legislators and other people in positions of power who we're relying on them to cast a vote, and they need to hear from us. I recently called our representatives in this state because the Department of Corrections had a report come out about the mistreatment of women at Coffee Creek. This was made public on OPB and might also be on NPR at this point. I don't know, because I don't have a big bandwidth for listening. My friends notify me about things while my confession is still keeping me a little bit out of the technology world. So I called our representatives to tell them that I wanted to be on the special panel that's getting organized to discuss how we're treating adults in custody at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. And it was really comfortable to do it. And I think it could be that comfortable to call, and there's like different buttons you push to leave your area of concern, your opinion about something, a matter that you want them to know about. And the more of us who are making those phone calls, the more that they're going to be listening. And since I've known some of our representatives, either while they were there in Salem or when they had moved on from that position, I've spoken to some of them in real time over tea or coffee or on Zoom during the pandemic. They really do listen to what citizens are saying. So if we're not calling with our perspective or concerns, somebody else who has a very different perspective might be calling. Right? And it's their job to listen to the citizens who elected them to be there. So I do want to encourage us, just as you're saying there, to feel what it is, nihilism, despair, collapse, feel into it, allow it to get metabolized, because without allowing that, we become like half of who we could be. And then we're trying to act from that half full, half resilient person. We're not we haven't metabolized what is really scary. So we can become more emboldened, more courageous after metabolizing those kinds of emotions, which we'll probably have to cycle through on a regular basis. So I think of it as a cycle that we're going to go through. But please make phone calls to the legislative people who represent you. How about somebody else who'd like to share something, either here in this room or on Zoom? Feel free to unmute if you're on Zoom. Step in, yeah.
I don't know, I'm just like brainstorming right now with you all and wondering, Sarah Joy, this is my first time listening to you about climate awareness, and so I'm not sure exactly how you run it, but I would like to throw it out there to maybe like to make it simpler for those who are listening, like including me, for example, like great, yeah, wonderful talk. Give me tips or like simple steps besides the ones like I am aware about, like how to be aware of my impact in my own home, for example. Like, would you suggest or invite us in each session to focus on certain element to dive or topic to dive more into, or give us like a guiding set of steps to decrease our carbon impact, for example, or do some like tactic, like tangible, like tangible goals, as they say in some therapies.
Yeah. So I do have a couple of top suggestions that I make on a regular basis.
Yeah, thank you.
So let me name a couple of those, because it can be helpful to you to have a context for. These are actions that will shift your awareness. So it's going to change our mindset. And it's also going to put us in direct relationship with wanting more, which I was discussing a bit ago, that, we have that mindset often as a species, it's already there. And then we've had this very well-developed civilization in the global north, in the dominant culture, and we expect that we're allowed to have more, or that we want what we want when we want it. So, for example, and this is what I'm going to navigate often myself. So when you go to the grocery store or you're ordering food from, for me, it's Instacart, because I don't drive. I can walk to the grocery store. I don't go very often because I grow a lot of my own food. However, there are things that I need, like olive oil and sea salt, and, certain things that come from a long distance to be at the grocery store. So I really take to heart, what am I purchasing and how did it get here? How did it get here is a part of what you're purchasing, and who was growing it, who was required to work in the field, and who is benefiting from this thing that I'm purchasing, who might be getting exploited by this thing that I'm purchasing. So there are certain things that I don't buy them when I see how far they traveled to come. And I've done research into some favorite foods to find out how they're made, or like, is somebody being exploited in making this food? I want to know more about it. So I watched some documentaries about food, which was also a very important wake-up call. And just to be maybe a little bit heartbreaking for all of you, the chocolate industry is really painful. It's a significant pain. What is required to get the cacao beans? What is happening to the people who harvest those? How they live and what risks they take to do that? Which highways they have to cross in their indigenous land to go get the cacao beans or to deliver the product to somebody. And they're crossing on foot. You know, it's like what is happening to create cacao and chocolate, and what happens in the sugar industry in this country where people are working in the sugarcane fields in the dilapidated sheds that they live in without healthcare, without resources. So I researched by this food documentary series that I saw on Netflix before my second concussion. What is the one chocolate that they authorize as a company that doesn't exploit and doesn't have this difficulty? And it's a chocolate brand called Tony Chocolonis. Fortunately, it's really delicious. And I limit myself to like a square of chocolate when I'm eating it because I really take it into my heart that this is a privilege to have this and where it came from and all the thought that went into the product for the company. And I also don't partake of other chocolates. So I really looked into it instead of just taking it at face value what somebody might be saying about their product. Similar to that, because of how things are made and the exploitation of people, for those of you who dabble in things like wine or coffee, you may want to think differently about the wine industry and the coffee industry and who's being harmed in creating those products. If you're here in Oregon, we have a big wine industry in Oregon. Probably in California also, you may have some of the same issues there, Luna, that I don't know about Washington State if you guys have a wine industry. I don't know if it grows well up there in Washington, and you don't have to tell me, Maria, because what I'm going to say is something for all of us to explore. In this state, we rely on migrant farm workers, migrant families to help with the grapes at harvest time and to produce the grapes and the wine. And I went to a fundraising event many years ago because I was connected to people who were in the wine industry. I was connected there through Ronald McDonald House. The Ronald McDonald House Charities had a connection to these wine growers. And they were talking about this wonderful fundraiser that they had put on as the Wine Association, that they had raised enough money to help give some medical care to the farm workers, to the migrant workers. And I was like, you had to raise money to give them medical care? You don't provide them with health insurance. You don't help them. They don't have citizenship. You had to raise money to care for them. Don't you make a lot of money in this industry? You're raising money from wealthy people to help give medical care to these people that you're exploiting. I couldn't stay at the fundraiser, you guys. This was before I knew about climate. I was already leaving this fundraiser before I had as much knowledge as I do. This was like almost 10 years ago. I was appalled that people felt so good about themselves to be raising money at this event to help people that they were actually damaging. So when you look at things through this lens, it changes what you want to purchase and what you say no to. And as that's occurring, it's going to shift your mindset. So we're going to have to be more local anyway. We realized that during the pandemic that it's called long chain food supply is at risk. Sometimes it'll be a weather event. Sometimes it's a global pandemic. It could be that the roads become too hot for the transportation vehicles, or an airplane can't take off on the runway. For example, when I was in Australia in 2018, I could not come home on time because the airplane could not leave on the runway. It was too hot. The tires might have caught fire, right? So long chain food supply is going to be and already is an issue. So we want to be more localized anyway. And if you think about what you love, like nearby is this great grocery store called Barber World Foods. It's owned by a Lebanese family. They have so many amazing products in there. And I love things that they have. Is that where I should be getting my olive oil? It's coming from the Middle East. It has to come a long way to get here. At first, for many years since I've been in this house for 23 years, I was like, oh, it's so wonderful and exotic, and I'm purchasing it. And now I have to think about my purchase. because I want to think about the planet when I'm making a purchase. So this is one area of awareness that I recommend. And is this in the tactical line that you were thinking of, Muna?
Very much so. Thank you.
Yes, so the documentary series that I saw on Netflix was called Rotten, R-O-T-T-E-N, Rotten. You can look at it. It was a documentary journalistic perspective on various foods in the industry. If you enjoy avocados, you might not want to watch the documentary series because it's also going to come up as an issue.
They are all disturbing, actually, but you actually broke my heart right now with the chocolate news.
Yes.
Chocolate.
Yeah. If you become aware of what it takes for the sugar industry, and also what the sugar industry has done to our well-being, what has happened with the quickening of people's need for sugar and what it does to our bodies and brains and our endocrine system. So we are then experiencing that sort of like opium for the masses. We become more ill and less vibrant and less likely to act or, stand up, more likely to go for more sugar in this case. And interestingly, how they use sugar to study the behavior of rats, right? It's often part of what they're doing in behavioral study is these little sugar drips for the rats. And they measure things based on how often they go to the sugar drip. I'm using rats because we're also mammals, right? Yes, Devika, cashews and almonds. For almonds, it's also to consider it's how much water it takes to grow one almond. Right, so these are difficult things because we're going to start being in the practice what yoga calls apatigraha, non-hoarding, non-grasping, apatigraha. And also what we call vairagyam, reducing our desire for something, reducing our clinging for something. So loosening our grip on having to have, for example, almonds, cashews, avocados, certain kinds of chocolate. Reducing our grip on that is actually going to awaken you to other foods to eat and perhaps to something local and seasonal, which is also Ayurveda would say it's better for our health and well-being to have that as well. But it's going to open your awareness to what people have been through to produce the food that comes to your grocery store, as well as people facing food famine right now, food shortages and famine. It's really devastating. The droughts on the planet that have caused that are not the result of the people who live in those regions. And yet they're the ones suffering from the drought. Another tactical sort of personal awareness raising thing that you can do, Muna, and I confess that I'm not always good at this one, though I was in the early period of my awareness on this one, so you can try it on and see how soon you forget and how many times you have to remind yourself. If you unplug your devices, your things, and only plug them in to use them, you'll become aware of the grid that you're tapped into. You'll become aware of it every time you're using something when you plug it in. In Australia, you have to turn the outlet on to use it. In the home that I was visiting anyway, which is my Dharma teacher's home, Catherine Ingram, she's become a climate awareness person in these last decades of doing Dharma. So I was visiting her. She's my friend, like my big sister. I feel fortunate to know her that way. And in her home in Australia, you have to turn the outlet on to use it. And then you turn it off when you're not using it. We don't have that innovation here. So we have to unplug. And when you plug in, you think, okay, I'm tapping into this grid. There are certain things I do keep plugged in because people are relying on it here in my home, like the internet. And it's probably better to keep it plugged in rather than destabilizing it all the time. But you can unplug your teapot. I keep the refrigerator plugged in, but I don't have to have the crock pot plugged in all the time. If I'm not using it, it's not plugged in. But there are other things I have forgotten to unplug and then have to plug in to use them. Watching our habit of convenience is another thing to look at. It's inconvenient to have to plug it back in. How inconvenient is that? It'll be more inconvenient to have no electricity, to have the power grid fail. Am I speaking too harshly? Okay,
I was just wondering though, do you, just by having something plugged in, is it taking electricity?
yeah, so when things are plugged in, you're drawing electricity from the grid. Yeah.
It's not in use.
Even if it's not in use, having it plugged in is drawing some power, even if you're not using it. Yeah. And it's not particularly my budget for the electricity. I have solar panels on the roof, so the city of Portland PGE is paying me for electricity. They give me money every month because I'm generating more electricity than we're using. So it's not the financial expense, but the awareness raising that comes with that.
As you become more aware about with myself, that I have trouble being social with my same people.
Yes.
It's shifted my awareness so much that I prefer, well, which brought me here, I guess. My family was like, maybe you need to do a yoga training, meet some people that have your philosophy. But it shifts, my shift has been so great that I just want to be by myself alone.
Mm-hmm.
And have a harder time bringing up a conversation with my family and friends who
Yes.
I've been close with my whole life.
Yeah, so I think another tactical thing, to use Muna's wonderful word, is that we need circles of empathy. We have to be connected to people who are able to talk about it. And do you feel a little bit more enlivened having been here for this conversation?
My goodness, yes. Just so filled with gratitude.
So when we can access sources of empathy and connection about these conversations, we will actually feel less alone. And that will help us to then be able to have a conversation or broach a conversation with somebody. Like I can imagine that Devika is going to feel more encouraged in what she was talking about before. She doesn't need to be pushy with her spouse, but maybe more encouraged to ask about it on a regular basis or more rhythmic way to say, because she's been here with us today. And I know I feel more encouraged even being able to open up or create the conversation. I'm not by any means knowledgeable about all that's going on, but I want to have the conversation because it keeps me engaged. And then I can talk with my family about it. And my family is largely uninterested. My parents live in the Hudson Valley. I don't know if you followed this, but when Vermont was flooding, for those of you who are from the East Coast, when Vermont was flooding, one of the riskiest places to be was in the Hudson Valley. So I asked my parents how they were doing, and they're like, oh, we're totally fine. It's just like a little bit of rain. And are you not paying attention to, you're totally fine, but how's the Hudson Valley? You know, I'm just asking, like, I'm not asking just about your well-being. Of course, I want to know that you're safe and healthy, but I would have liked them to say something more like, yeah, it's a pretty significant thing to have Vermont. We used to go to Vermont to go skiing when I was a child, so we've been there a lot. That I was hoping they might say something more about the devastation in Vermont and the precarious nature of the Hudson Valley and other places that were getting the runoff from those floods. But they didn't. And so I got to take the initiative to open that up with them. And I don't push my parents to have more capacity than they have, but I don't shy away from and decide that they have no capacity. And I find out after a few passes on something that, in fact, they are wanting to pay more attention. I used that phrase just now, a few passes on something. So let me say where that comes from. And it's similar to what Devika was sharing about the water drops. There's an anecdote that I will not recall perfectly, but it comes from Buddhism, where they're talking about how to come to peace, how to find equanimity or tranquility. And one of the teachers describes that this bird of peace, which is a certain kind of bird, it is holding a scarf, like a silk scarf, you know, from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in its beak. And this bird flies past the mountain many times, and each time it flies past the mountain, the silk scarf touches the mountain. And my teachers in Buddhism, they were saying, and eventually the mountain is feeling that and responding to it. Eventually the silk scarf gives a little bit of erosion on the mountain. They start to notice each other. The mountain and the scarf and the bird begin to notice each other. And they do it so gently that this is how my teacher was recommending that we come more and more to peace. And then we act like the bird with the silk scarf in our beak, and we just allow it to come by people. We just sort of brush by them to offer some peace from the peace that our practice is building in us. And perhaps eventually we make enough passes on a conversation, we pass by the topic enough, we give them another chance to experience it, that we brush up against it, and then it starts to influence in a positive way. Again, not in a dogmatic way. Does that make sense to everybody? So you can picture yourself like a bird of peace with a silk scarf. And when you pass by somebody in the marketplace that you, by your own interpretation, assume they're uninterested or they're naive or ignorant, you could imagine the silk scarf just touching. And I say by our interpretation because we actually don't know. We don't know what people are aware of or not aware of. We don't know the struggle that they're facing to buy the other chocolate in the grocery store. When you're in the aisle getting the Tony Chocolonis and you see somebody else getting the, I don't know, Ritters or something, you don't know that what they do know or don't know, or the struggle that they face about it. So I recommend non-judgment in this case, but we can still give a little metta or a little peace shawl like that. Go ahead, Angela. Oh, Tony Chocolonis. Yeah, they may not have a vegan option. You could write to the company though and say, hey, I'm really interested in your like ecological awareness and all the stuff that you're doing. Where's the vegan option? Yeah. In fact, it's one of the recommendations by some climate journalists and activists is that if we all became vegetarian and even more than that, vegan, it would make a significant impact on the climate. And that's a discussion for us to have at another time because our time is closing here today. Because there's also people in the regenerative agriculture field that are saying, actually, we need some of the livestock to hoof the earth, to turn it over, and we need their waste materials to help fertilize the soil. And so there's two sides of this conversation going on. And recently, the YouTube channel called Facing Future TV, facingfuture.tv, which is now hosted by Dale, but was hosted by a man named Scott, whose last name I have forgotten. They recently had people of opposing viewpoints in the same discussion, which she often does that. She brings people of different viewpoints together to have these kinds of conversations. So she was talking about this. Her perspective is to be vegan. And then she had other people recommending other things for the soil. And they were all interested in climate. None of them was interested in damaging the climate. They were all interested in the climate. So these are considerations also. But this is a good chance for you to write to Tony Chocolonis. Get them on the line. Hey, Tony. I heard good things about your company, but I need a vegan option. We're out here. The vegans are out here wanting ecologically sound chocolate. What's that? You're waiting. You're going to call him too, Tony. Just to be clear, I don't know Tony and I get no benefit from talking about this. Yeah. So let's just check in as a group now about, how does it feel to be here? How does it feel to have a conversation? Some of my colleagues are concerned that my yoga students are going to be depressed. So could each of you just say for a moment, what is it like to be here? And, energetically, what's it like for you? Can I start with Mandy?
Yeah. I have a lot of questions and feelings percolating. So it's not complete. So I'm having a hard time finding words for my feelings, but to be in community, that's something I'm familiar with, and to be here with you guys, and to hear so many beautiful and important shares in this group was really touching and encouraging. And I'm just really glad to have made it. I did the struggle of should I go or should I not go? And I'm just so grateful and so glad that I did because it was so valuable for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. Yeah, we probably can't get completion in 90 minutes. Mona?
I'm just so happy I came across your webpage and found you and realized, yes, she will be my yoga teacher. And I just feel so nourished and loved by being in this cohort in the 200 hour. I feel like we're becoming like close knit, and it was beautiful to spend the last 3 days with you. And I also appreciated the presence of Mandy, Stevie, and Maria and their heartfelt sharing with us. So thank you for showing up.
Thank you, Mona. Can we go to Maria?
Sure. I am feeling very inspired and encouraged and very heartful. I spend more of my time kind of in sadness and despair when it comes to this topic. And I would say that after this session, I feel less depressed. So you can tell your colleagues. And I feel really happy that this community is here and these teachings and this discussion is available. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Stevie?
Yeah, I can agree very much with Maria of having the opposite reaction. I don't feel more depressed. I feel more, I guess I'd say kind of enlightened and more like upbeat about what I can do, and that there are other people that are interested in this. And I think a phrase that I'm coming to is it feels like a homecoming to have this type of environment, to be able to speak to different people in this way, and then have this be able to grow as you were talking about being able to being that scarf, and I loved just even those little bits and pieces of information we can take with us to be able to go about the rest of our week. And so I was so excited when you were going to offer these sessions again, because it's something that I really enjoyed back in 2020. And I just thank you very much for this. And so to those colleagues, I think this is a great opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Stevie. Devika?
I agree with everyone, and I feel in sync with what everyone said. And from Mandy, that there is, I'm losing out on words because there is so much to think, say, questions, answers, and like everyone said, appreciation and opposite of scared or opposite of worried. I feel that surrounded by people who have similar thoughts or stronger thoughts would only encourage me more. And that I felt for a moment that I put my husband on the spot and maybe open to judgment. And then when Sarah Joy spoke about her parents, it made me more relaxed that it was okay. And this was a safe space to speak and a non-judgmental space to speak. And a whole lot of all those emotions, and that even a little bit counts. And even though I've been called out, my friends, that I'm a so-called nature freak, I don't know, or a climate freak or obsessed or overdoing it. And then they say, but you use shampoo in the bottles and that's also causing pollution. What is your problem with using disposable? So I'm coming back to that because I've been called out so many times. So I've realized through this conversation that even a little bit is okay, whatever I can do. And that there are so many other people here who understand my point of view and my worries. And this was a really good conversation. This was really good.
Davika, thank you. Thank you very much. And let's go to Chell.
Yeah, I'm feeling like a lot in my body right now. This is a topic that I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about. So yeah, it feels just intense, I guess, to talk about it. And part of me feels like very conflicted about having such an emphasis on personal responsibility, because I do feel that like there are these massive corporations who really are contributing so much more than just like me or you, and so yeah, I think there's a part of me that does feel a little like angsty about like, well, but are we going to talk about these big corporations and like, will my energy really like where is my energy best spent in this conversation? And I think a big part of me feels like it is really about changing policy and like going towards a higher level, like a governmental level rather than like changing a specific, like I want to have hope in the drops in the buckets, but it's hard for me to have that. Yeah, and so yeah, I feel a lot, but I do really appreciate just the space to speak out loud about it.
Yeah. So one of my strategies in our platform and what I would recommend when we're with an individual or in a yoga class would be that as we awaken to it, we become greater in numbers. And it has to include not only the personal responsibility that transforms how we see, but then how we feel that we could address those large corporations, that we could stay abreast of that news. We could tolerate the news of that more when it's on national or international news. We could tolerate hearing and we could take action politically. I definitely want us to be a part of influencing policy. Who we vote for matters greatly. Who's actually listening to people and how we cast our vote is going to be really important. So while we may be starting here, I want you to also feel free to step in whenever the conversation we feel like I need to bring on, again, the topic of corporations. What about corporations? So I would consider to be a both and the corporations. It illustrates how much dominance they have been able to capture and how mute so many people have become, partly because they're benefiting from, in their limited lifetime perspective, there's benefit to them. I mean, citizens who are benefiting from being in the global north and the dominant culture. The CEOs and the people of power in those major corporations are benefiting hugely in a financial sense. And there's nowhere going to be for them to go shopping. There'll be nobody here to enjoy their wealth. There's like the short-sighted nature of those people with so much power and so much wealth. Like, where will they spend it? On what? What air will they breathe? For how long? So those things are on my mind as well. And if I invite you to bring it into the conversation when it comes up for you while we're here together, for sure. Yeah, you're welcome. And then let's go. This you guys can see. Yep, Erin.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, political activists that way too. So I want to hold people to the fire. I just finished reading the second half of Braiding Sweetgrass. Have you ever read that? So have you read that? Not yet. It really helped me like merge the movement with the science, with really like the ancient, like the indigenous like viewpoint, and like how how it blends together, like why we are here basically, right? And that did inspire some hope. I don't know, it's not practical, but it gave me like a new, like it helped me like want to continue to develop my new way of relating to nature as a form of resistance or a form of revolution, I guess. So yeah, I just wanted to share that I feel like I started studying climate science in the 90s, you know, and we're still here and we're worse off than we were. And that's like hard to grapple with. And yet I only have the choice to continue, you know, trying. And so I'm really grateful to be here and talking about it and have a space to share with you all.
Thank you. I appreciate what you said. And we'll go to Angela.
It's just
I can't hear Angela actually.
I'd like to just continue with this journey and every day, hopefully just make conscious decisions and be the red scarf.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, thank you everyone for having been here and being willing to contribute and listen and share in whatever way you were able to be present here. I really appreciate that you have been here. Yeah. I see the final chats in the chat as well, so thank you for those. Okay, let's close with a prayer. And bring your hands to your heart if you'd like to. Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Shri Guru Pyo Namaha Hari Om. Thank you very much, everyone. Namaste.
Thank you for a wonderful weekend, Sarah Joy, and have a sweet night, everyone.
You're welcome. Yes. Please take care of yourselves, everyone.